This amendment changes Article 28 of the Colorado Constitution to the Colorado Revised Statutes 1-45-102 and 1-45-103.7 concerning campaign finance limits. Hold on one sec. The major provisions. Do you guys need a page number? Did somebody find it in there? 17. We're on page 17. Thank you. This amends the Colorado Constitution to encourage the establishment of campaign spending limits rather than voluntary spending limits. It amends the Colorado Revised Statutes to urge state lawmakers to establish campaign spending limits rather than encourage voluntary spending limits, and amends the Colorado Revised Statutes to instruct the Colorado Congressional Delegation to propose and support the Colorado State Legislature to ratify an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that limits campaign contributions and spending. Some background. The practice of voter instruction to elected officials was widely used during the founding period of the United States and was used successfully to pass the 17th Amendment for direct elections of U.S. senators. 10 years ago, Colorado voters passed comprehensive campaign finance reform that set contribution limits. It banned corporate contributions and required full disclosure of campaign spending. Oh, those were the days. In the past, courts have ruled that limiting contributions to candidates and campaigns were a permissible restriction on money in politics to prevent corruption or the appearance of corruption. More recently, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that money is speech and cannot be restricted. Therefore, spending limits on campaigns are not allowed, and spending by persons and organizations independent of campaigns are not restricted. If this proposal is passed, it is mostly symbolic and will not have any legal force. Joining us today are Elena Nunez from Colorado Common Cause and Ari Armstrong. And Ari, are you representing myself? Himself. Elena, you have 5 minutes.
Great, thank you. Good evening. I'm so happy to be here tonight again talking to the Colorado Social Legislation Committee because the issue of money in politics is one that we have talked about many times over the last 10 years that I've been in Colorado. And I actually remember coming to this forum back in 2002 when we were working on Amendment 27 to set campaign finance limits for Colorado elections. Unfortunately, since then, a series of court rulings, not limited to Citizens United, but certainly that was one of the most egregious, have really stymied our ability to have meaningful campaign finance limits in our elections. And as a result, the common sense reforms that we've all worked for together have now been undermined, and we've seen the floodgates really opened to big money in politics. I don't need to tell you that here in Colorado, we're really at the eye of the political storm. The Denver media market has seen nearly $20 million in television ads this election year. That's just in the Denver area, $20 million. And that's part of a much larger pie. Since the Citizens United ruling, which as you heard, opened the floodgates by saying 2 things in essence. One, that corporations could have a direct role in our elections if they were making so-called independent expenditures. And then 2, that we couldn't limit those independent expenditures because there was no corrupting influence by spending millions of dollars on a campaign as long as you didn't give it directly to the candidate. Those 2 flawed rationales in Citizens United have really opened the floodgates, and now we've seen the rise of super PACs. And those super PACs are now allowing the wealthiest millionaires and billionaires to have an undue influence on our election. Just looking at the money from the first 6 months of this year, of the money raised from individuals to super PACs, more than $230 million, more than half of that, 57%, came from just 47 people. That's just 47 people who gave at least $1 million each. What that means is that our elections are being decided by people who can write much larger checks than the rest of us. Amendment 65 is an opportunity to stand up to big money in politics and start to reclaim our democracy. It tells our congressional delegation that we want to see action on a federal constitutional amendment that would allow us to set meaningful contribution and spending limits in our elections to create a level playing field. Now, as you heard, it's not a binding force of instruction. Our congressional delegation will have to use their best judgment. But if we, the people, who passed campaign finance reform in previous years, pass this again and say this is something that's important to us, that is a pretty serious instruction to them, and they'll have to take seriously their charge to represent us in Congress. A yes vote tells our congressional delegation that we think that elections should be decided by we the people, not the moneyed interests who are paying for the nonstop ads, the nonstop mailers, and really distorting the electoral process. The other impact of all of this money is that since the rise of super PACs, so much of it is also being undisclosed. There was a study that actually just came out this morning. It started circulating over the internet. The Sunlight Foundation, they studied money in politics and studied where the money comes from. And they found that since October 1st, so just this month, super PACs and other outside groups, so these are the groups independent of the political candidates, have spent more than $87 million. And nearly $45 million of that was in undisclosed money. So not only are we seeing more money than we've ever seen before, but it's coming from sources that are completely unaccountable, and we don't have the transparency to make good decisions about who's influencing or trying to influence our elections. Amendment 65 is crafted in the history of voter instructions. The idea that we, the people, have a responsibility to tell our elected officials how we want to be represented in Congress, and that if we do so, they can then take that message and represent us. That was how, when there was direct election of US senators and there was a lot of political apathy, shall we say, in Congress to shift that model of election, it was the people going to their ballot boxes who were able to make that shift and start to create the momentum that led to direct election of US senators. Again, I think this is an opportunity where we're not going to see change happen in Washington, D.C. It's going to take us here in the state showing that as Coloradans who care about money and politics, and who want an election that's not for sale to the highest bidder, where we don't have billionaires writing multi-million-dollar checks. We're going to have to be the ones to stand up and say, the current system isn't working, we want to see real reform. And you'll hear that it's symbolic, and that's true in that, yes, we cannot require anyone to do anything, but given the state of our laws, this is the opportunity we have to stand up and take a stand. You'll note there's literature over by the door. You'll see there's a broad list of groups who are endorsing this measure because they see that the impacts that we care about, whether it's environmental issues, health care, social justice, that those policy outcomes are distorted by the influence of money in politics. I encourage you all to visit voteyeson65.org. Thank you.
I would like to start by asking you in the audience a simple question. First of all, thank you for having me here. Thanks for having all of this. This is, I think, really fabulous that you have an event like this to talk about these important issues before us. But answer a question for yourself. Are you going to vote in this presidential election? I use that example because that's one where the big money is really coming in because it's a nationwide race. Are you going to vote in that election because you are sincerely looking at the differences between the candidates, the issues that they stand for and they talk about? And you think that you bring your reasoning mind and ability to think for yourself and independent judgment to bear on this choice before us? Does that describe you? Or instead, are you manipulated by outside influences? In other words, is it the case that you're a zombie watching television, and whatever ad you see, that's going to influence your vote in the presidential decision? Which is it? I think if you ask people, pretty much everyone will tell you, well, look, I'm the sort of person who will bring my independent judgment to bear on these important issues facing our country. But it's those other voters, the stupid ones, the unwashed masses, they're the ones who are just the zombies watching television, and they are going to be unduly influenced by these political ads. Ms. Nunez speaks about elections being decided by checks and money and interest. That is obviously untrue. It's not like they're buying people's votes. They're not paying you $1,000 to go vote for one candidate or the other. You retain the right to vote your conscience. What they are doing is proposing their ideas and spending money to do so. So I suggest to you that this idea that we need to restrict speech, i.e. censor speech, so that these other voters, not me, right, but the other voters who are too stupid to actually think for themselves, that is elitist, And it also leads to severe problems. So let's talk about the interest group politics. And this is something that I think we agree on. There is a huge problem in today's government in which some interest groups spend their money to lobby, and by the way, this doesn't address lobbying, to spend their money to lobby, they spend their money on elections, campaigns, in the hopes of getting political favors. In other words, subsidies, corporate welfare, special legislation that harms their competitors. I recognize this is a very large problem in today's form of governance. In fact, I spend a great deal of my time thinking about this problem, writing about that very problem. But think about what we're proposing here, though. We are saying that politicians are corrupted by interest groups. So therefore, what are we going to do? The proposal is to allow today's politicians, the same ones who we are saying are corrupted by interest groups, to write the censorship laws controlling speech. That doesn't make any sense. In fact, based on the presumption that the problem is corruption, the last thing on earth you should want to do is put the government in charge of censoring our speech. These laws, written by incumbent politicians and the interest groups with a seat at the table, how are they going to write these censorship laws? What groups are they going to benefit through these laws? I suggest two main groups. The first is the incumbent politicians. Isn't it convenient if, as a politician, you can shut up your critics and say, you may not legally criticize me? Now, we talk about corruption. That is inherently corrupt. That is inherently self-dealing. That is a reason why, primarily, we have the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. You know, this talks about a new amendment to the U.S. Constitution about speech. We already have an amendment to the United States Constitution pertaining to speech. It's called the First Amendment, and it's served us well since its ratification. And we ought not do anything to limit or restrict or gut the First Amendment. And so, of course, these laws would also protect moneyed interest groups against their political competitors. We've already seen that campaign laws have been used to shut up not the big moneyed interests, but the little people, the people who cannot afford the legal representation to maneuver all this bureaucratic red tape. That's going to shut up. If you have lots of money to hire an attorney to go visit your friend politician, you're not going to be radically affected by these laws, or you'll find plenty of loopholes for yourself, shall we say. If you don't have enough money to hire the lawyers, you're going to find yourself dragged into court by your political opponents, as we've already seen today. Now, we hear this idea that, well, big money interests drown out the little guy. That's just not true. Pat Stryker is worth $1.4 billion. She has spent millions of dollars in Colorado elections. In fact, Vincent Carroll has an article about some of her expenditures in today's Denver Post. And yet, nothing Pat Stryker does limits my capacity to speak. I can still speak as much as I could before. I have one thing to fear in terms of my ability to speak, which is the government censor. The government censor is the only party that can shut me up.
Thank you. I think at the core of this debate, Ari really highlighted nicely, it's the question of whether or not you think spending money is the same as free speech. And I think the former Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens got it right when he said money is property, it's not speech. Unfortunately, the court's flawed logic saying that money is the same as speech allows those with more money to have a greater voice in our elections. And I would posit to you that although on election day it's one person, one vote, everything leading up to that in terms of our election is distorted by those who have more money and have more of a voice. And that's why it's so important to create a level playing field. And I think that's important in a couple of ways. One, if I as a donor want to have a voice and I can't write a multi-million-dollar check, my contribution has less meaning. I can still make it, but it has less meaning. And two, if I want to run for office and I don't know a bunch of people willing to spend millions of dollars on my behalf, it's a lot harder to get elected president these days. And that's the reality of why this flawed logic that money equals speech means that people with more money get more speech in our elections. Thank you.
Excuse me. Nobody actually argues that money is the exact same thing as speech. Instead, the argument is that in order to speak, unless you're talking about going out on the street corner and yelling at people, right, you have to expend resources in order to advocate your ideas. Well, let's just take an example. To advocate Amendment 65, Ms. Nunez heads a group called Coloradans Get Big Money Out of Politics. To date, this group, Coloradans Get Big Money Out of Politics, has raised over $100,000. Meanwhile, there's no group registered against Amendment 65 because, as we've mentioned, it doesn't actually do anything that's legally binding. And interestingly enough, some of the big donors to this group, Coloradans Get Big Money Out of Politics, is Common Cause, the very group that pays Elena Nunez's salary. So what we're talking about here is people spending money to advocate their beliefs in the public sphere. Now, as far as the speech goes, this is perfectly acceptable. She is not restricting my speech by spending well in excess of $100,000, where I'm spending the money it costs me to drive in gas to get here. But in terms of imposing the censorship, that's what's going to restrict free speech.
So we have a few questions, and certainly if you do have some more questions, we have time for a few more, I think. First question, is there any way that we can ensure that other states, feds, also pass similar measures or take a similar stance?
Thanks. Well, what I will say is I think there is a growing movement. Voters in Montana have a similar ballot measure on their ballot this fall to vote on a similar instructions measure. We're seeing local communities across the country passing similar instructions. So I think there is a rising sense that there's a problem with the way our elections are funded, and we need to do something about that. And by Colorado being a leader, I think we can be an example of the fact that we don't have to sit back and just take all of the ads and go, well, this isn't quite the way I want my democracy to work, but instead we can lead the way in showing that the voters do have a voice. And I will just add, into Ari's comments about money, the flyers we have, the yard signs, they do cost money. And I think that he would acknowledge it's helpful to have that when running a campaign. The question is, when it comes to electing leaders and ballot issues for that matter, is there a way to do that in a way that does create a level playing field so everyone has a voice and we can have a true marketplace of ideas? That's one.
I think it might be useful just to read some of the language that's in the actual proposal to give us a better idea of what it does. It says, the voters instruct the Colorado congressional delegation to propose and support and the Colorado state legislature to ratify an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that allows Congress and the states to limit campaign contributions and spending. So in other words, what this is trying to, they're looking for a U.S. amendment that allows both the U.S. Congress and state legislatures to restrict campaign spending. It's campaign contributions and spending. And it's obviously the U.S. Congress would do that at the federal level, state legislatures would do that at the state level. And obviously to get this through, you need this collaboration of multiple states for any congressional amendment. Federal.
Why is it more important to limit money than to require complete transparency for all contributions to both campaigns and super PACs, including the amount contributed?
I would say they're both important. It's important to know where the money's coming from, but at the same time, knowing that Sheldon Adelson spent $36 million on the primary campaign on the Republican side, that's not a wholly satisfying reality for anyone who wanted to have their voice in that primary as well. So I think it's two pieces. One, it's complete transparency, which we don't have, and which we continue to fight for. That was something that's core in Colorado's campaign finance laws and is an ongoing fight with attempts to limit that disclosure, even at the state level, in our state level ballot issues, candidates, where we see continued attempts to make less transparent disclosure requirements rather than more. But then the second piece is, how do you then make sure that not only do we know where the money's coming from, but we create a level playing field so everyone has an opportunity to have a meaningful voice in the dialogue.
So I think that there are two questions on the table. One is transparency, the other is this quote level playing field. On transparency, I used to not think very much about this. When this really became a live issue to me is when my friend and I actually spent the last two election cycles fighting, you might remember this, the personhood measure on the ballot. We were against it, I don't know what your positions are. And we raised just over $3,000 over 2 election cycles to do this. And my friend, in order to do this, since she was the leader of our 2-person group, right, she had to register with the state of Colorado, file paperwork after paperwork, comply with 100 pages of regulations. And ultimately, she said, I'm going to stop raising money. This is a nightmare to comply with. I'm going to stop speaking my mind on this issue. I'm going to stop raising money. And that's just one example. So I've come to see that this transparency quote, this is not a problem if you got millions of dollars. You just hire the lawyers to file all the paperwork. Who this really affects is in very small groups. A friend of mine got dragged into court by his political opponents for doing something that the Secretary of State said he could lawfully do. But then it had to go through the court system. There's a case here in Colorado, in Parker North. In fact, there's a regional case decided on this basis. And in this case, this community group spent a few $100s on this annexation issue. For their trouble, their political opponent dragged them into court. They spent far more on the court battle than they ever spent on the annexation issue. And so what I've come to see is that really, if you have a lot of money, this doesn't do anything to you. You just operate the same way. You just hire one more attorney. But if you're a small group, just spending, just barely above the thresholds for where you have to comply with this, you find yourself in deep trouble and at a constant risk of being dragged into court for literally for making paperwork errors in all this paperwork requirement. That's probably going to talk about later. I do want to talk about this level playing field idea, though.
This one's addressed to Mr. Armstrong. If every voter brings his or her judgment to the ballot box, why are campaigns spending hundreds of millions of dollars on ads that supposedly influence no one?
My claim obviously was not that ads don't influence anyone. That was not my claim. Clearly, ads do influence people. In fact, I receive a lot of campaign ads that are against one candidate that actually persuade me to vote for that candidate because they remind me that this candidate actually supports positions that I favor. So clearly they are influential. And in some cases, this is perfectly legitimate. I get some of the ads I get are actually factual, talking about the issues in front of us, and they're truly educating the voters about real issues. Now, there's other flyers, which you can read about in the Denver Post and elsewhere, which are intentionally misleading, which are taking things out of context, and these are frankly despicable. They are. And do they sway some voters? If they persuade some voters, right? Some people are persuaded by bad speech. Some people are persuaded when the KKK gets up and rallies. But you know what? Since it is extremely dangerous to say, well, some people are persuaded by bad arguments, therefore censorship. That's why we have the First Amendment. Let me grant that it is dangerous for people to be persuaded by bad ideas. That is dangerous. Orders of magnitude more dangerous than that is censorship, which is used by people who have political power to block out the critics of government who don't have that kind of political power. And that is what is truly dangerous. So don't make the mistake of going from, well, we have these problems, therefore censorship. Censorship is going to exacerbate, make worse, every single problem that has been discussed here today.
I would just add, we're not talking about censorship here. We're talking about creating a level playing field so everyone can have a voice in our elections. It's not about censoring what someone's able to say. We will all still, if this amendment were to pass and we were able to reinstate, in some cases, meaningful campaign finance laws, we would still be able to say whatever we wanted. However, the millions of dollars or billions of dollars that are going into elections to distort who's able to be heard, that would be something we could control. Because the problem right now is if I've got the microphone or a megaphone and Ari's just whispering, whose argument are you going to hear? And it creates a distorted political process and a distorted public debate.
This one is up for grabs. Why is there no truth testing by unbiased individuals or groups? I see lies that are passed off as truths.
That's a big one. I think it's an interesting question because we have seen news agencies attempt to do this, the truth test or the monitoring of political ads, and actually some of the Common Cause chapters in other states have run volunteer programs to attempt to fact check them. And I think it's a good project and one that we should all try to do more of. It's just a matter, I think, of resources to be able to see all of those ads and then do that analysis. I think we are seeing now with the internet, as someone mentioned at the beginning, that is a way to have more of those conversations, but that's not a regular part of our process, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is misplaced. Whoever is asking the question, you're it. You're the fact checker. And then any independent media that we have, there's lots of groups that check facts. In fact, candidates themselves will come out and say, well, this ad was unfair, right? And so, I mean, look in the mirror if you want clean politics, is the first answer here. Now, I want to clarify something, though, about Amendment 65. Amendment 65 does not say the billionaires of the world, the Pat Strikers, those are the people going to be affected by the laws. In fact, there's no monetary provision whatsoever. Here in Colorado, with the existing campaign restrictions, the trigger is $200. $200? That's big money in politics? That's what we're talking about here? What's going to be the federal restriction? Well, we don't know. This is totally non-specific as to what that language is going to look like. So we're not talking about just about billionaires here. We're talking about regular people who may want to pool their resources. You know, let's say I have 20 friends who want to pool in $1,000 each, promote some position or candidate. Am I going to be free to do that? We don't even know yet, right? But I do want to address quickly the level playing field. Look, the level playing field, which we should be concerned with, is equality before the law, which is exactly what the First Amendment protects. Pat Stryker has the right to speak as much as she wants, spend as much of her own money as she wants on her views. I have the same right to speak as much as I want, spend as much of my resources as I want. Now you can say she spends more. That doesn't limit my ability to speak. It just doesn't. In fact, I can speak about what she's saying, and that gives me more of a platform in some respects. But what Ms. Nunez is talking about is not this sort of level playing field equality before the law. She is talking about equality of outcome. In other words, we are going to forcibly shut up people with more resources as defined by the politicians and interest groups in power. Right? So that supposedly, based on this myth, that people with fewer resources will have a louder voice. It's a bad premise, and it's also a totally false idea of what equality under the law is meant to be and should be.
Our last question, and this is addressed to Elena. Many of our elected officials are the recipients of money in excess. How will the voters of Colorado be able to require them to vote for or influence others not to take excess money from these super PACs?
Again, I think there are two issues with that. I think the first is that the campaign to actually get a constitutional amendment that upholds the values we all care about, assuming we're successful on November 6th, that campaign starts November 7th. Because it's not enough to just say we want to do something and then leave it in the hands of Congress and hope that it turns out well. We do have a lot of work to do to make sure that something that's meaningful and actually creates a good process for money in politics is established. The second, and I think this goes to the concern about who'd be writing those laws, in Colorado with the initiative process, we do have the ability to craft more laws. And you can see throughout the state, different cities have come up with different campaign finance laws that suit the needs and interests of their community. And likewise, at the state level, we have a voter-initiated law that we put into place after the legislature weakened the one that the voters had put in the first time. So I think it's up to us to make sure that they do it right when it comes to the constitutional amendment, and then it's up to us to work together on meaningful reforms that achieve the goals we all care about, assuming we're successful.
So is this my last go? What are the values we all care about? Well, one problem with Elena Nunez's case is that a lot of us have different answers to that, or at least a different emphasis. And so what we're talking about here is shutting up the bad people, right? The people we disagree with. They should be shut up. Well, we should be free to speak, right? Because we're the good people. Well, this is kind of problematic. This is why we have free speech. Because then there is no government arbiter on who the bad speakers are and who the good ones are. But in terms of this idea of our shared values, to me, the most important shared value we have are embodied in the Bill of Rights. Most notably in the First Amendment, which protects our right of free speech, our freedom of conscience. And to me, this is what is really primary here. And, we can use whatever euphemisms we want to talk about shutting people up by force of law. That remains and is censorship, pure and simple. Thank you.
Thank you, Ari. Thank you, Elena Nunez. Ari Armstrong.